My name is Branko. I'm a faculty member here at the Sociology Department, and with great pleasure, I will be hosting and introducing our speaker for tonight's Boğaziçi lectures. We have launched this series of talks in 2013 as we were celebrating our 150th anniversary. And 2013 and all those celebrations feel like a different time space now, a different country of a different era almost. And we were talking about them very much, but I do not think we had really fully grasped the meaning of or the importance of strong roots at the time, as we were yet unaware that we were about to be caught up in very strong winds of change. The recent pandemic being only one of those, really, especially here locally, in Boğaziçi and in Turkey. The main aim of this lecture series has been to integrate the current discussions and arguments of the prominent scholars around the world to Boğaziçi's academic environment, and thus contributing to the already lively scholarly debates within our campus and its areas of influence. Powered by Tekfen Foundation since 2019, Boğaziçi Lectures has been hosting its prominent guests under the revised title Boğaziçi Lecture Feyyaz Berker series, a title paying tribute to Feyyaz Berker, one of the founders of Tekfen Holding, but more importantly for us, our graduate, who has immensely contributed to the enrichment of scientific and cultural resources of our university in his life and after. I would like to thank very much to the Tekfen Foundation for maintaining these lectures, and I believe they offer a very apt medium to commemorate Feyyaz Berker, who has always cherished education, learning, and freedom of thought. Today we are here to listen to one of the world's leading economists, Professor Milanović. First of all, I would like to sincerely thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We are very pleased and honored to have you, even if virtually, here with us. I would like to extend our warmest welcome again. I cannot think of a better time to listen to you, actually. Professor Milanović is a visiting presidential scholar at the Graduate Center at City University in New York and Centennial Professor at the London School of Economics. Among various other positions he held, he was the lead economist in research department at the World Bank. His main area of work, as we all know, is income distribution and inequality. He approaches these issues from a distinctly global perspective. He's published widely on these, many influential journal articles, many influential books. I will only name the books he has written in this decade. He first wrote The Haves and Have-Nots, a brief and idiosyncratic history of global inequality. In 2016, the book he wrote, Global Inequality, a New Approach for the Age of Globalization, has been translated to 16 languages and was awarded the Bruno Kreisky Prize and Hans Matthöfer Prize. His most recent book is Capitalism Alone. I like the title, The Future of the System That Rules the World. Much more of his accomplishments can be listed, but I will just lastly mention that Professor Milanović was awarded the 2018 Leontiev Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic knowledge. So as I said, it is more than fair to say that he is just the right scholar to listen to for those of us especially interested in the entanglements of global inequality and global capitalism, and more importantly, the future of capitalism, which has been, in a manner of speaking, up for grabs at least since 2008, and its tensions rendered much more visible with the pandemic, even for those who wouldn't want to see them before. I've been teaching this course, Social Change and Development, my students probably are here in the audience, since early 2000s. Back then, in the thick of neoliberal capitalism, the things we discussed, like 19th century liberalism, its crisis, post-World War II arrangement, its crisis, 1980s, its crisis, all seems like a history of bygone eras to my students. Turkey was doing very well. All this, so capitalism seemed very stable. Today, the disposition of my students is very different, caught up in uncertainty and change. We are all aware that capitalism's trajectory is being remade. This semester, we began the course with your article, Global Inequality of Opportunity. And as the future of capitalism and its arrangement is taking shape right before our eyes, our speakers' insights this evening will be most valuable in expanding our view and helping us make sense of the new arrangements that are in the making. In this evening's lecture titled Recent Changes in Worldwide Income and Their Political Effects, Professor Milanović will talk about the winners and losers of the major changes in global income distribution and the political implications of this major reshuffling. Before I leave the screen to our speaker, let me finally say that he will be speaking for about 40-45 minutes, and there will be a Q&A session following his presentation. You can send your questions to the co-host friends of mine through the chat function, and I will be relaying your questions to him at the end of the event. Professor Milanović, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I am, of course, extremely happy and delighted and honored to be at Boğaziçi and to be in Istanbul, I mean, virtually. I have to say that I've been many times in Istanbul, so it's a city that I, like very much and I know very much. And even my first work in the World Bank, which very few people know, was on Turkey. So, of course, in those days, we were traveling mostly to Ankara because obviously the relationships was with the government, but it was always a pleasure to be in Istanbul, and I was there several times at Boğaziçi before. So it is actually a little bit of a homecoming for me, although this homecoming looks very different now when we are all virtually, connected. So thank you again for the invitation. As you said, I would speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. I would speak mostly about global inequality, global income distribution, but of course there will be some questions about capitalism per se, and I'm sure that many of them might actually come up at the end of the talk because of the basically because of the work in the new book that you very kindly mentioned, Capitalism Alone. Now, when we really talk about global inequality, I think that actually we should, and as I talk also in the Capitalism Alone, we should see the uniqueness of the current period in two developments. The one which basically starts with the end of socialism in East European countries and really the transition of China to capitalism, which I would be very happy to explain why I believe that actually by all Marxist notions of production, China is capitalist. So if you take all of this into account, basically you have now for the first time in history the entire world being operated or be operating on capitalist principles. This is a new development not only because of the existence of socialism until only 30 years ago, but because even before 1917 and the socialist revolution, you had other than capitalism, you had many systems which were either slavery or serfdom, which are actually systems with unfree labor. As of course many of you know, unfree labor existed, for example, in the United States until 1865, slavery, then Brazil until 1888, in Russia until 1861, in Central Europe, in Austria-Hungary, the serfdom was abolished, so-called forced labor was abolished only with the revolution of 1848. So basically, capitalism had other challengers then, and then they had socialism as a challenger. Well, now I think there is no other challenger simply because that's the only system in the world, which also now is invading our private space, including our leisure activity. This is a topic I will not talk about today, but for some people who may be interested in that, in the commodification of free time, for example, I discussed that in chapter 5 of Capitalism Alone. Now, the second big change is the reemergence of Asia. That's, of course, a huge change because Asia, in particular China and India, have been at the same level of income development, or actually same level of income, as developed parts of Europe until approximately 1400 or 1500. So when we look at the two last centuries, they are really a little bit of an anomaly in the sense that Europe, after the Industrial Revolution, became much richer than Asia, much richer than China. And this is an anomaly because historically, for the previous 2 millennia, that was not the case. So now we have the rise of Asia, and that will have, as I will show you in a minute, that will have very distinct effects on global income distribution. It would have, of course, very specific effects on geopolitical power and economic distribution of activity in the large Euro-Asian continent. So I would also then say something about changes between 1988 and 2008. And then finally, my recent work, which would actually bring these results up to the 2013. I'm currently working on the data from 2018 so that we can actually have an insight as to what was the situation before the COVID crisis. And maybe in the questions and answers, I would say something about what I believe may be the effects of COVID. So let me then, if we have time, maybe in the Q&A, I will say something about main inequality trends in the West and China, but we should leave that to see later. Let me start with the first thing, with the first slide, which I think is a very important slide, which shows you an estimate. And I have to say an estimate because really we have, for the past, the best we can have is really rough estimates. An estimate of global income inequality. When I say global income inequality, that means inequality in income between all individuals in the world that exist at that time in the world. Now, obviously, we cannot have now 7.8 billion individuals with their income levels. So what we do now, since mid-1980s, we actually have national representative household surveys from most of the countries. Currently, I have about, on average, when I do that every 5 years, between 130, 160 countries, and they include 95% of the world population and about 95% of global output. But for the past, as you notice here, the horizontal axis is the year, the vertical axis is the Gini coefficient. So for the past, we go back to 1820. So how do we do that? I will not go through all the details. It's based, actually, the original work was done by François Bourguignon and Christian Morisson. It was based on GDP per capita data that are produced by the Madison Project. As you know, Angus Madison was this big originator of study of GDP per capita in historical context, going back actually even to year 1 for some countries. And the new results just came out several weeks ago, and I would encourage you, it is actually available. You can, download them. All the countries, including Turkey, obviously are there. I think Turkey goes for the last, I think the data are quite plentiful for Turkey, so it's probably for the last 3 centuries. So then they took actually GDP data for those countries, and of course in those days the number of countries were smaller, and they had some estimates of inequality within each individual country, mostly based on so-called social tables. Social tables are this contraption that lists per capita income of social groups and their size. So it starts with, let's suppose, nobility, aristocracy, then merchants, then smaller merchants, then workers, then guild workers, peasants, and so on. So what they did, they actually put these 2 types of data and calculated global inequality. Now, look at the beginning. In the beginning, it was just after the Napoleonic Wars. We have a Gini coefficient of 55 for the world. Now, that coefficient of 55 is high, but it's not something unusually high because this is the income inequality that we have in many Latin American countries now. So the world was, as a whole, had inequality which now we can find, for example, in Chile or Colombia. But then you notice, and I will explain the reasons behind that, the entire 19th century, you see upward sloping line. If you look at this blue line, it just keeps on going. In other words, by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of World War I, practically, we are at the level of Gini inequality globally at 70. Now, what is behind that? And I think this is very important to understand because we will see the opposite happening today. there are two factors which push this blue line up. One, probably the most important, is that some parts of the world, essentially Western Europe and North America, joined by Japan afterwards, became much more developed. So they basically took off. It's like a little bit like a big bang. They just took off, became richer. The other parts of the world, obviously Africa, but more importantly because of this population size, India and China stayed at the same level of income. And actually, in the case of China, there was a decline in real income of China. So that created a huge gap between the West and Asia. And it is that gap that, of course, then when you translate that into global income inequality, means that global income inequality has risen, because simply you have people who in the past used to be close to each other in terms of income, and now they are very different. On top of that, so that's the second element, on top of that, within most countries, and particularly the countries that we know reasonably well, like the UK, you had internally an increased inequality. So these are the two factors that push global inequality up. The between factor of rising differences between GDP per capita between the rich and the poor countries, and within each individual country, you had an increase in inequality. Then you notice during the 20th century, you have very high inequality, but there is no significant change until the end of the 20th century. This is what I call the World War II and US dominance. It was a period where essentially the West was much richer than anybody else. And the world really had a tripartite distribution. You had Western countries at the top in terms of income level. Then you had socialist countries as like second world, poorer than the first world. And then you had the third world, which was essentially, which were, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So it's not for nothing that actually that so-called tricontinental was actually created in those days. And it is not for nothing that the perception was then that essentially the bourgeoisie of the world was really people from the first world. This is a big change compared to the 19th century, where you could argue that bourgeoisie was actually bourgeoisie of individual countries. But really the gaps, as you can see with the Gini coefficient 75, the gaps during the most of the 20th century were really very steep, very big, and they were mostly geographical. Now, the third period, which begins at the end of the 20th century and that we live through now, is a mirror image of the Industrial Revolution, because now there is another technological revolution in Asia. So what it does, it reduces global inequality, because countries that used to be poor, like India and China, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, are all now catching up, having higher growth rates than the West, and reducing inequality. So this is really I want to show you the breakdown between this between and within components. And essentially, if you were to look at this large slide and say, well, how can we sort of visualize in terms of very important people, I would say the first period was basically the Karl Marx period, because of the rising inequalities within nations. So not only were differences between nations rising, but also within nations, inequalities became great. The second period of the 20th century, I thought the most sort of adequate person to bring up was Frantz Fanon, because of his argument that essentially the world is now being split, as I said before, between the bourgeoisie and the working class on a geographical level. So that the bourgeoisie was everybody who was in the first world, and the working class was everybody who was in the three continents, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The same thing can be expressed in the following way. This bar, the blue bar, shows you the gaps between nation states. As I called it before, the overall Gini coefficient, which is, or the tail index in this case, which is due to inequalities between nation states. Now notice that in the very beginning, in 1820, that gap was very small. And I recently kind of tweeted the new results from medicine. You know, the gaps between China and the Netherlands, for example, were about 2 to 1. So the gaps between Western European countries and Asia, particularly more developed parts of Asia, were small. And generally the gaps between nation states were small. And, you know, you can see that even in the literature, you know, of the early 19th century. You know, rich people in rich countries were similar, and poor people in poor and rich countries were also similar. So then you have, this red or orange bar, which shows you the level of total inequality, which is due to differences within countries. So the red bar shows you the total amount of inequality due to differences between, for example, aristocracy and peasants, capitalists and workers in each individual country, then summed up across all the countries. So notice in the very beginning of that period, after Napoleonic Wars, if you take the world as a single entity, most of inequality comes from inequalities within nation states, because the red bar is much higher than the blue bar. So that means essentially that most of inequality is not because people in the Netherlands or England at the given income level are better off than people in China. It simply means that most of inequality is because there is large inequality within each nation state. Well, as you see here in the 20th century, that has changed, because the blue line, the blue bar rather, becomes now dominant, meaning inequalities are mostly an artifact and product of large income gaps between the countries. And you see also stability in this red bar, or even somewhat of a decline in the red bar, because many countries actually went through a period of reduced inequality after World War II. Western countries did that. East European countries did as well because of communism. Even countries that followed import substitution policies like Brazil and Turkey had a decline of inequality. So that was a period where internal inequality went down, but inequalities between nation states increased. Finally, the last period, you notice the mirror image of what happened in the 19th century is that the blue bar now shrinks. And the blue bar, of course, shrinks because of the rise of China and India. So I called the first period the age of empires and class struggles for the reasons that I explained. The second is the age of the three worlds and diminished class conflict, because the class conflict diminished simply because within national inequalities went down. And the third period, which we are living now, is the period of the rise of Asia and recapturing of that economic position that Asia had in the past, and internal cleavages. And indeed, actually, internal cleavages reflected in rising within national inequalities is something that actually has certainly made the study of inequality much more prominent, even if global inequality is on the way down. But inequalities within nation states are increasing, and this is really one of the reasons why we are quite concerned about income inequality. So this is the same story now with, instead of bars, I just did it with lines. I will not go over that. Let me just show you, for example, a nice quote illustrating that period from the 1960s, 1970s, where the world was divided in these three large chunks, parts of the world, where most of inequality was to the differences in income between countries. You can read this nice, I'm not going to read the entire quote from Senghor, the Senegalese president, when he basically thinks of a class struggle between nations. So it's no longer between bourgeoisie and workers at the level of nation state, but at the global level, because there are some proletarian nations and there are some bourgeois nations. And exactly this is what we see. Of course, Senghor did not have the graph that I've shown you in front of him, but basically he captured what was the essence of the situation of the 20th century. So let me then if we can get this slide to work, yes, let me show you a little bit in historical perspective how it looks. This is a nice slide because we can here combine income distribution data over different periods of time and compare the position of China to the UK. So let me show you what it means. So we start here with 1870. That was after the Opium Wars. It was the time of, you know, total European hegemony over China, what is called today the century of humiliation of China. And what the graph shows you, it's at every, on a horizontal axis, you take the 10th percentile of the income distribution of China and 10th percentile of the income distribution of the UK. And then you say, okay, what is the income of people at that point? And then you compare the two. So on the vertical axis, you see the percentage of Chinese income at that point of the distribution compared to the UK income at that point of the distribution. Now, the number 40, which is here, shows you that the poorest people in China, which are at the 10th percentile, had an income which was about 40% of the income of the poorest people in the UK. So they were poorer, but not that much poorer. They're approximately at the half of the income of the poor British. What you notice here is that as you go further in the income distribution, excuse me, the Chinese become relatively poorer and poorer. So in other words, if you go into the middle class of China, let's suppose around number 50, they would have only an income which is less than 20% of the equivalent middle income British. And then if you go to the very top, you notice also that they would have an income which is now only 15% of an equivalent British. So in other words, at the top of the income distribution, the rich Englishmen or British people would have an income 6 times higher than the Chinese. At the bottom of the income distribution, the poor Briton was about twice as rich as China. So that was in 1860. Now, at the time of the revolution, how was the situation? You see, it's a sort of a huge decline of the relative position of China. Everybody now is at about 10%, which means that at whatever part of the income distribution, the Chinese have only 1/10 of the income. This is all adjusted, by the way, by purchasing power. They have only 1/10 of the income of the British. So this is yet another way to see what I've shown you before about global inequality, because the ratios between China, India, and the West really basically determine what happens to global inequality. And you see it here very clearly. The decline of China, which meant, of course, the rise of the West, created that large increase in global income inequality. That was really what was pushing the Gini up. Then we go to the present, and actually I should update this because it is 2013, but now, of course, the situation has changed again. You see here, of course, a significant change in the sense that China now has improved its position with respect to the UK at every point of the distribution, and it has particularly improved its position with respect to the rich. In other words, the rich Chinese now have an income which is 1/3 of the income of the rich British, which is obviously an entirely different and much more favorable position for China than it was the case in 1950. So here, I mean, you see again what is driving the global inequality down now. It's really the rise of relative position or the relative incomes of many Asian countries, despite the fact that those Asian countries among themselves are actually becoming more unequal. Another illustration is when you compare Chinese and American income distributions. You see here in 2002, the two distributions did not overlap much. In other words, relatively few Chinese would have an income which would push them into the American income distribution. Obviously, China is still significantly below. We are talking to a significant gap in real incomes between China and the US, which still exists. But as you notice here, by 2000, excuse me, by 2013, you already have an overlap between these two distributions. In other words, there are more Chinese who have now entered into the domain of the US income distribution. So that's, of course, a huge change. I would say something more about that now when I talk about what I call the greatest reshuffle of individual income positions since the Industrial Revolution. And I want you to sort of think of this in the following way. Imagine that you have 100 cards, like playing cards, and each of them is the percentile of the global income distribution. And your country, depending what type of overall income it has and what are the incomes of people, would take certain positions within that cards. So you could be in the card 65, meaning that you are on the 65th percentile in the world. Or you can be in the card 100, meaning that you're in the top 1 percentile in the world. Historically, for the last 200 years, the very top 20 cards were practically entirely populated by people from Western Europe, North America, Oceania, and more recently, Japan, Singapore, and Korea, more recently. So these are, even very poor people from those countries would seldom go below 70th percentile of the world income distribution. On the other hand, China, India, Indonesia populated really parts of this, deck of cards that are much sort of inferior. Well, what is happening with the rise of Asia, and precisely because so many people live in Asia and they are moving up, is that some of these people would move into these top 20 cards. But when you're talking about ordinal positions, that means that if somebody moves into the card that I was holding so far, that means that I have to go down. And this is something that actually is happening now, but I think it will start happening in a more dramatic way. And this is an issue which rich and Western countries will have to face, is that gradually a significant percentage of their population would no longer be in the top income groups globally. They would have moved towards lower global income groups. That might not at first seem to you a big deal because we really look at our position nationally. However, lots of our consumption patterns depend on global consumption patterns. It's actually whatever the global elite or the global middle class or the global upper class sort of desires to have and consumes. If your relative position shifts downward, these will be the goods that would be no longer available to you. In other words, what I often give an example, you will not have a situation in 20 years that even a working family from Germany would be able to go to a 4-week vacation to Thailand. Because if Thailand continues growing, it would be very expensive to do that. Actually, Thailand for that working class in Germany would become like Sweden. So they don't go to Sweden for 4 weeks of vacation simply because Sweden is too expensive. So there will be changes of that nature that would underlie this greatest reshuffle of individual positions, definitely the greatest reshuffle since the Industrial Revolution. So this is really the period of globalization that we are now living through. Now, of course, that period, in my opinion, started really in the period about 10 years between 1978 and 1991. I'm not going to read all of this. Many of these changes are quite well known. And, excuse me, you can read them yourselves. But what I wanted to emphasize is that in a period of about 10 years, we have had an incredible change in the economic systems in almost 2/3 of mankind. We had a change in Western Europe, we had a change in the US, we had a dramatic change in China, dramatic change in Russia and Eastern Europe and in India. So that was really the watershed years, which still determine what we do today, because we have not really gone to a different type of economic system from the one that was actually established in the late 70s and all the way in and throughout the 1980s. So, and maybe that will be a Q&A. So when people ask me often, like, since 2008, there was so much talk about inequality, but what has happened? And you really have to scratch your head and find almost nothing has happened. Because if you compare what happened there in 10 years, these were dramatic changes which totally changed economic landscape of countries. And we are now facing, in many levels, significant crisis. But when you look at the policy action that was taken, it's quasi non-existent. So we really have a big, how should I say, dissonance between what people or some people believe should be done and what the political process can deliver. In this case, as you can see, the political process delivered a pretty big change. So then when you compare 1988 global income distribution to 2011, you can also see the change in the shape, which is very important change. In the 2011 and in 2013, very similar, you have this thick part in the middle, which you can call global middle or global, middling class, because this is not a global middle class in the sense of the middle class in the Western sense, because these people are not as rich. They're actually relatively poor by the Western standards, but they're in the middle of the global income distribution. And as you can see here, this is where the distribution is becoming thicker. So that's where actually lots of action takes place. So we have some creation of what you can call global, I call this sometimes global median class. And that was not the case in 1988. In 1988, you had really lots of people bunched at very low level of income, as you can see here. And then you have another peak. That was what Danny Qua called the twin peaks. You had another small peak of rich people on the right, but there was nothing in between. Now the between has actually been filled mostly by people from Asian countries. Now the same story is told by this graph that many of you have seen, which became quite popular. It's called the elephant chart, and it became popular for the following reason. And there is actually a good reason that it became popular, is that what it shows you on the horizontal axis are percentiles in global income distribution. So obviously the lowest, like 1, is the poorest people in the world. The top 100 is the richest people in the world. And then on the vertical axis, it shows you what was the real increase in income in PPP terms between 1988 and 2008. Now, the 3 points are the most important on this graph. The first one, which will not surprise anybody, is that people in the middle of the global income distribution, and that's quite a lot of them, maybe something like 30% of people in the middle of the world, actually, so it means more than 2 billion people, have had a fairly good period in terms of percentage gains. So in this graph, you see the average percentage gain was 80%, but since this is all worked at the level of percentile and deciles, you had some deciles in China that had, for example, tripling or quadrupling of the real incomes over that period. So that's the people in the middle, in other words, did quite well. Now, the next point, and I called it for simplicity, China's middle class in this graph, just to give you an idea who is mostly there. Then the next point on the bottom, I called it US lower middle class, but it really includes basically lower middle classes from all OECD countries, rich OECD countries, and in particular, US, Germany, and Japan, because these 3 countries, if you put them all together, include more than 500 million people. And if you look at their lower parts of the distribution, I suppose below the 50th percentile, they include 250 million people. And these 250 million people did not have a very good period between 1988 and 2008. In other words, their growth was quite low and close to zero. in real terms. So the contrast between these two is really striking. In other words, you have people with lower incomes, but who are in some sense competing with people from the West with higher incomes, but whose growth is not going anywhere. So the position of this US, so-called US lower middle class is even made more difficult because when you look at the top of the income distribution, this global top 1%, which of course had a very good period and has grown also by 70 or 80% in the meantime. So you have then the Western middle classes being in some sense squeezed from both ends. They are squeezed from behind because the Asian middle classes are advancing and taking jobs that belonged originally to the Western middle classes, whether they're doing that through import competition or through outsourcing. And on the other hand, the top of their own country's income distribution, you know, the top 5% in the US, has been doing quite well. So this is basically, I think, the story which politically has been played in many West European countries, starting from France, UK, and obviously United States, is this dissatisfaction of the middle classes of those countries with both the fact that they are being sort of displaced by the Asian middle class in terms of their income, and that there is a general, how should I say, indifference to their fate from the people at the top in their own countries, which actually have done pretty well during the globalization. Finally, let me just put a speculative thing here, because if you look at results like this, obviously a certain kind of tacit agreement might exist between the people at the top of the income distribution and the Asian middle classes. And actually we have seen that, I think, in the United States with large outsourcing of jobs and technology to China, because in that particular, from that particular type of globalization, both of them benefited. People in Asia benefited because they got jobs that paid much better than what they had before. And people in the West benefited by being able to hire people in Asia at much lower cost than if they were to hire people domestically. So this really, I think this graph became, you know, popular because it really, in numbers, highlighted that issue. I actually remember when the first time I derived this stuff, it was in 2002. Let me just think for his, 2012, yes, 2012. I was actually kind of shocked when I saw it because it really basically, it gave you in numbers what you knew was happening, but it's very different when you see, when you can know something in kind of theoretically, and then you see it like empirically that it does actually happen. Okay, so I want really then to finish with simply bringing this elephant graph to the present, going to 2013. So this is the graph which is exactly the same as the previous. The idea is the same, but it covers 2008 to 13. So it actually starts with a financial crisis and it pushes it 5 years. Now, what you notice on this graph is that the two positions out of the three are still the same. The middle has really continued with very high growth rates because basically Asian countries have continued growing very fast, and the middle classes in those countries are growing fast. And then you notice that actually the Western middle classes still are growing at very modest rates. In this case, the rate is about 10% cumulative over five years. But you notice that the top 1% has been affected by the global financial crisis. They have grown very little. And some preliminary numbers, for example, from the US show that by the 2018, the global top 1% has recovered in the sense that there is still, then in 2018, there is an upwards, tick, like in the previous graph. But here in 2013, we do not see it. the bottom line then is really that there was no change in the gains of Asian middle classes, which started in 1988, and there was no change all the way to the current crisis. There was likewise no change in the sluggish or absence of growth of the Western middle classes that started around 1988 also and continued all the way to the coronavirus. And then, of course, we can discuss what will happen now when hopefully the coronavirus has been defeated, but we basically have a period of something like 30 years of significant reshuffle of global incomes, which is driven by the rise of Asia, by the fact that Asian populations are entering into the global 20%, and by the absence of the growth of the middle class in the rich countries. And this is, as I say, okay, here is that basically continued strong growth around the global median and no improvement for Western middle classes. So this is something which actually is really continuing throughout. And let me just show you, I think this is maybe because I'm running out of time. Let me just show you in the period 2008, 2013, what we see using either household survey data or national accounts data. You see actually Asia, this is the second from the left. The first is Africa, where we have a large discrepancy between growth rates as recorded by household surveys and growth rates recorded by GDP. But you see Asia, 40% cumulative increase either by service or by GDP. And then you see here that the countries with the abbreviation VNAO, which is Western Europe, North America, and Oceania, having either negative growth by service or really very modest growth by national accounts. So basically the tendencies which started with late 1980s continued for another 30 years. So let me then stop here. There is many other things, and I would like maybe to mention this one, but maybe I will start with Q&A. This is a graph that shows you for different countries where their positions in the national and global income distribution. It's a very nice slide, but I think actually I will show it in the connection of in the context of Q&A, because I think I should stop here. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad that despite the breakup in the middle of the voice, we still managed to listen to this wonderful talk. And now I have a couple of questions already posed, and then you can continue to write your questions, and then I'll try to relay them to Professor Milanović. One of the questions is from Murat Ulman, and he's asking he's asking basically how can you talk about individual incomes in the 1950s in a context like China, where there is where it is under communism. So how can we talk about individuals and incomes in that context? Enes Özcan is asking, what about the change in inequality inside Asia? How much?
Okay, can I have only two questions at a time? Because
okay, this is the second question that I'm giving you. What about the change in inequality inside Asia? I mean, how much the rise of Asia can be sustainable regarding the internal inequalities of Asian countries? So I'll stop here.
Okay, the first question, I mean, let me divide it into two. The question is actually, do we have the data about income distribution in China in 1950? That's one question. The second question, how can we speak of income distribution in communist country, but that's no different than income distribution in capitalist country. We have data on incomes. We have data on PPPs. So we just do it the same way. Like if you look at most East European countries had household surveys from the 1960s annually. And we have PPP numbers from 1988. And for the PPPs for earlier years, we actually make projections. So it's not, any different from any other country. But the question is actually, do we have household surveys from China? And that's the problem. You know, we have only, to my knowledge, one household survey in China, and it was done in 1952. Then the household surveys in China continued. They were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. So basically, there was a huge hiatus in income distribution data for China all the way to 1982. Now, from 1982, we have annual surveys with many other problems that I don't want to go into now. I mean, this is the whole, you can write a whole book, and people have done that because Chinese surveys have many issues. But they do exist, you know. In Luxembourg Income Study, with which I work, we have micro data from China for 2 years. And then recently I had a paper with 2 co-authors. We also use microdata from 4 surveys from 1988 to 2013. So, you know, the Chinese data are far from perfect, but they do exist. Then the next question was internal inequalities in Asia. Yes, of course, China internal inequality has increased. I don't have here in this presentation, that's something that I use in my class a lot, data from China. You know, China in 1982, which, as I said, that was the end of the Cultural Revolution, so things kind of started going back to some normalcy, had a Gini which was below 20, which is really extraordinarily low. I mean, this is like a Gini that is below levels of Slovakia or Denmark or Austria. And nowadays, Chinese Gini is higher than the US. So China has a Gini of about 45, US has a Gini of about 41 or 42. So there was a dramatic increase in inequality in China, driven both by rising rural inequality and rising urban inequality. But I have to say, in the last 10 years, according to the data that we have, because also, again, there are some issues with the numbers, we have actually stagnation of urban inequality, and we have for all of China basically flat inequality. Now, is this really true, or was there some sort of data problem, particularly with respect to the so-called floating population? These are the people who are actually recorded as living in the rural areas, but de facto live in the urban areas and often are not included in the surveys. That's also possible. So it could be that we are underestimating the current level of Chinese inequality. And I didn't mention other countries. India, of course, had also an increase in inequality. So did Vietnam.
Okay, I have many questions coming in. I'm not sure if I can sort of relate all of them, but of course, Birgül Demirtaş's question sort of captures a few others as well. People are wanting to know about the impact of the COVID-19 on income inequality, global income inequality. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit if you want to. And another question pressing on the first question actually is, isn't it sort of wrong to compare communist and capitalist countries by individual income, since many services were public in communist countries? I think that was the spirit of the first question as well. Maybe you can go back to that one. So I'm just not counting that, and I can pose you another question. What were the specific policies and economic models that sort of specifically triggered the rise in rise of Asia? That's another question.
Okay, let me re-answer that question about communist countries. Yes, this is true. Actually, these services, for example, education and health, are not taken into account because we are basically working with disposable income and not including benefits, social benefits in kind. Technically, it is possible to do that, and there have been studies that are doing that, but it's very complicated because you have to have data on consumption patterns, and also you have to do the data on education, like how many children are going from a given family are going to school, and whether the school is public, and then you assign the cost of schooling divided by children, so you actually have to assign that as an income. So it is doable. It is seldom done because it is very complex in terms of the data requirements. So we don't do that. But it is not a problem only of communist countries. You know, we don't do that for Sweden either. We don't do it for Denmark. We don't do it for Germany. We don't do it for Turkey. You know, you should technically impute the value of social transfers in kind, and as part of your income, but because it is difficult, it is not done. However, the part of consumption in kind, for example, which is important. For example, you take Eastern Turkey, and you have lots of households there that they have a so-called home consumption. In other words, they produce for themselves food and other things and consume that. That is taken into account by surveys because we ask questions about also home production. But yes, I agree that they are social services, they are free, and they are not taken into account. And that problem, of course, exists in communist countries as it exists in countries where actually housing and, where education and health are free. I would like to postpone questions on COVID because there will be quite a few of them, and I would like to talk about that at the very end, partly because it's very speculative. So I'm not going to say anything profound on that simply because we don't have any numbers on that. But so I would like to just, that will be the very last part of the conversation.
Okay, so here's another question. Volkan Yılmaz asked, would you expect the rise of Asian countries to have a trickle-down effect on African countries, given the increasing Chinese investments in some African countries? Sort of, and can I squeeze a question myself in as well?
Yes.
You said this in passing, but recently you've been interested in equality, economic inequality from a global perspective for a long time, but the recent interest has been tremendous, right? Piketty, yourself, people have become interested in your work, and yes, the inequality itself has become an issue. So can you sort of say, what are the implications of that rising interest? Why suddenly people have become interested in?
Yes, okay, they're both very good questions. Let me answer the Africa question. I did not have a chance to speak of Africa, but I think that for the future of what is happening to global inequality, Africa is going to play an absolutely crucial role. It has not played so far, first because it was poor and remained poor, did not catch up, and had a relatively low population compared to the Asian parts of the world. But this is changing now because, as you know, Asia, in particular China and India, are actually entering into a stagnant population. I think actually for China, we are expecting a decline in population. And on the other hand, Africa is entering into a population boom. So Africa, by sheer number of people, is going to really affect global inequality very importantly in the next 50 years. So unless something happens in Africa which makes Africa start growing at the rates on per capita basis, which are similar to what happened to Asia, we might have actually now a reversal of the tendencies that existed until now, which are the tendencies to reduce global inequality. We might have actually a reversal because of the falling behind of Africa. So in my opinion, if we have to continue, which I think globally speaking is a very good development, because ultimately our objective in the world, I mean, this is something maybe in 2 or 3 centuries, but our objective in the world should be to bring the average level of income in all parts of the world at about the same position. So, we should really, objective should be to eradicate differences, significant differences which exist between countries in probably next 2 centuries. To do that, African growth is then absolutely crucial. That would be very difficult to achieve because if you have population growth rate of over 2% and you expect in order to catch up in any significant way, you expect at least 5% per capita growth. That means that you would have to generate growth rates of 7 to 8% per year over a long time, which is really very, very difficult. But that's why I'm actually quite in favor of Chinese involvement in Africa, because I believe that by emphasizing infrastructural investments, they would actually help Africa grow, perhaps not as fast as China herself has grown, but certainly would help. And I'm very disappointed, I would say, by Western and particularly like big agencies like the World Bank and others giving up on investment in real things and moving to invest either balance of payment support, which is simply money to the government, or all of these very vague things like, transparency, improvement, or this or that, which really have, I think, very little effect on growth. Let me just give an example, which I think an extreme example. Like I remember when I was in the World Bank that cannot remember, is it Chad or another country that borrowed significant amount of money for Y2K. Now, many young people don't even remember what Y2K was, but this was this incredible fear, which was totally meaningless, that in the year 2000, because of the computers not having ability to switch, because it was all sort of programmed 1-9, so from 20th century, that there would be suddenly shortage of water, shortage of electricity and all of that. And then a country which actually had probably, 50 computers borrows in order to prevent Y2K. That was, total nonsense. But, unfortunately, this is what some international organizations were doing. And I think that it's good that China has come in and reminded them that actually, if you really want economic growth, you have to build, roads, to build factories, to build dams, to build trains, railroads. So I'm in that sense, I'm in favor of the Belt and Road Initiative. So that was the question on China. I'm sorry, your question was on, just remind me, what was?
And the rise of interest in inequality in general. I mean, it always, people have been arguing about it, but why now suddenly Piketty is a bestseller, everybody's listening to you, and, what does this mean?
Well, I think it was all triggered by the financial crisis. And, inequality has been rising since, in many countries, practically since mid-1980s. But nobody paid much attention. And I'll explain later, because the economics profession really was not interested in inequality for the reasons that I can explain. And they studied essentially labor economics, but they never really touched capital. They never touched really inequality, never touched the middle class, nothing. Okay, so what happened? I think what happened in the US, I think in other countries as well, is that suddenly when you had a crisis, particularly in the US, the middle class could no longer borrow. And what was happening is that absence of growth of the middle class income was really covered up by the ability to borrow. And they were borrowing borrowing from the banks. They were borrowing, as you know, actually there were several movies on that showing that essentially you didn't have to have any collateral, no money, nothing, no job to get a house. So they were like basically buying houses with, which were cost like several $100,000 with $2,000. And then they were, of course, borrowing on credit cards. And of course, they were paying large interest, but it was like a Ponzi scheme. You pay interest today and then you reborrow from somebody else tomorrow. Well, that Ponzi scheme came in the end in 2008. And I think then there was a realization that people first lost many of the things that they thought they had. And secondly, then they realized that their real incomes, for example, a median wage in the US has not really changed for like 30 years. The minimum wage today is lower in real terms than in 1968. So then they realized, look, we have really not been doing very well. And at the other end, at the top 5% or even 10%, people have gained tremendously. So I think the inequality became an issue, political issue, when people in the middle realized that they have had actually a bad period of 30 years and they were not aware of that. And after that, you know, with, of course, other movements like Occupy in the US, Indignados in Spain, then Gilets jaunes in France, and all of that, that became an international phenomenon. And that's why, of course, also unrelatedly, but at the same time, of course, Piketty's book contributed quite a lot to it, and also other people. So that's what I think happened. But when it comes to policy changes, as I said before, that would reverse these tendencies, I think we have seen almost nothing.
Okay. Yılmaz Pirli wants you to, if possible, reflect on the position of Turkey in this global context. If you can you position what's the sort of economic situation in Turkey? And also, there is a question on inequality of the differences between men and women in this greater picture.
Okay, let me do it very quickly on both of them. I could have actually brought, and maybe I'll send you, I want to show you this slide here, and then you will see why it is relevant for Turkey. But when I looked at I was in Istanbul maybe about 4 years ago, and there was a conference, and actually I looked then in the Turkish income distribution data. One thing which struck me then, and I don't know how much it has changed since, because the situation in Turkey deteriorated economically. But then what was striking in Turkey was really an improvement, and I think many of you, this is not a novelty, improvement of real incomes of the middle class. And when I say middle class, I'm talking, I think, broadly of people from the 30th percentile to the 90th percentile. But then not an improvement and sort of much lower real rate of growth for the people at the top 10%. So that was, I think, a striking result, because you don't have that often so obviously. You either have the so-called growth synchronous curves that also either go upward all the time, meaning that the richer grow faster, or the poor grow faster, then the curve goes downward because the largest increases are at the bottom. But in the case of Turkey, the largest increases then were in the middle, and it was a large middle. So it was not like a middle only 5% of people, but like 50% of people. But that might have changed, because of the economic difficulties since. So I don't know what has happened since that time. Of course, another thing which has been known for years is that Turkey has a high level of income inequality compared to other OECD countries. As you know, actually Turkey, when you look at OECD countries, you have the top OECD countries always being Chile, Turkey, Mexico, and Portugal. And then the US comes. So this is, Turkey is, of course, a relatively high inequality country among the group of the rich countries. But a gender issue. The gender issue cannot be disentangled in this global stuff. And I'll explain why. It cannot be disentangled because the unit of analysis from which everything starts in the work that I do is a household. Household, by assumption, has equal share of income. So, when I have a household, and let's suppose I have husband and wife and 2 children, the assumption of which is that the household shares that income equally between 4 of them. So, if it is not the case, and often it's not the case, maybe often, men take more of an income and so on, we do not have that information, and that information is very difficult to obtain. The only way that we can see the gender element, but it's really minor, is if you look at individual households, which are, so for example, households headed by women, and then you look at their relative position. So that's doable. In the Luxembourg income study that we have now, 60 countries, we have done, for example, that work with the US, comparing it with, I think 10 other countries. So you can actually see their regularities that female-headed households, particularly with children, are households with lower income. But it's really not possible to do globally. Simply the data like that are, you don't need the data, you don't have the data like that for all the countries in the world.
As long as the unit of analysis is the household, from what I understand, because sort of there would be different ways of sort of mapping this out globally. But
yes, but you cannot have, you know, I mean, household is not an arbitrary unit. Household is a key unit because most of the functions that are shared are within the household. You can do study of global wage distribution. Then, of course, the unit of analysis is a worker, a female, male worker. And there was a recent paper on that, the first paper in global wage distribution. So individuals units of analysis. But that leaves out, you know, everybody who is not employed. It leaves out pensioners, it leaves out children, it leaves out the unemployed. So and then it also doesn't give you any information who is being paired with whom. So you might have, let's suppose low inequality in wage earnings, but if all top wage earners marry each other, then inequality in income would be much higher than the inequality in wage earnings. And then, of course, you have also capital income. So you have to add capital income to that. So really, the household, for this purpose, households is almost inescapable as a unit of analysis.
Okay, two more questions, if you're not tired yet.
No, I'm not. No, I'm
okay, good. Bahar Özgüleç is wondering about the probable effects of changes that will take in economic organization in the near future, such as increase in automation and all that, how all this will be affecting income inequality. Automation, I think, is the main element.
Yes, I discussed that in Capitalism Alone. I'm what you call, you know, technological optimist. I do not think that we will sort of have, as some books are calling it, the end of work. I think it's really, honestly, it is a fantasy, you know, and why I believe that. Look, what we are now witnessing is really no different from what Ricardo witnessed in Principles in the 1870s. We are witnessing replacement of human labor by machines. But it has been going on for 2 centuries. And we know the effects. They are not, of course, good for everybody, because people who are being replaced by machines, for example, when we have replaced recently, you know, travel agents, we have replaced them by computers. We are now replacing, in this pandemic, retail stores by buying things electronically, and that will probably continue happening. So we are always replacing some types of labor with machinery, which, whether it's machinery is a, you know, cotton ginny, or it's a computer, or it's a robot. And some people get, of course, they lose their jobs and they get hurt. But this is only some groups of people. At the same time, we create enormous number of jobs that never existed before. So I think the same thing would happen with robotics. You know, we cannot tell what these jobs are, simply because if we knew that, we would be billionaires, because we would be able to invest and create this stuff. But we cannot tell that, but we know from experience that's how it has always worked. So I'm, in that sense, quite optimistic. Now, it might increase the share of total income that goes to capital. So that could be a problem for interpersonal income inequality, because people who receive income from capital tend to be rich. So that could push inequalities within nation states up. And I think that, yes, that's the real problem, that there could be changes in the income distribution. But I don't think this is not going to be the end of the world, and that we are not going to have 50% of people who have nothing to do. I absolutely don't believe that it would happen.
Okay, as we're approaching the end, I will sort of take you on your promise about COVID-19. And because there's another question here which talks about the data between 2013 and 18 and power shifts prospects in that period. So maybe we can end with some speculations about the upcoming period.
Yeah. Okay, so let me end with two things. I wanted really, as I promised, I wanted to show you this very cool graph, because that's one that actually I could put, I didn't do it this time, but I could put Turkey as well. So let me show you what it shows, what it displays. I take with the United States, I'll explain the US, and then you would see other countries. It would be all very easy to understand. You take percentiles of countries' income distribution on the horizontal axis. Let's follow this kind of red line in the middle. This is like the median of that country, like the US. And then on the vertical axis, you're saying where in the global income distribution is that particular percentile. And as you notice, in the US median is at something like 93rd global percentile, which is kind of what we would expect, because the US is a rich country. So if you have a median income in the US, you have to be above the world median, because the world is poorer than the US. And you notice here that the even poorest Americans are at the 60th percentile in the world. This is what I was saying before, how most of the people in the rich countries live really within the top 20%. So in the countries like the Netherlands, they would only start from the 80th percentile onwards. Then you take like urban China. So notice here, urban China is poorer than the US, but the gaps are not that huge anymore. And at the very top, of course, the very top 1% in urban China is also part of the global top 1%. You notice also that the Chinese person in the median at the China urban distribution is at the 70th percentile globally. Then you take rural China. They are, of course, much poorer. And at every point in the distribution, if you're in rural China, you're poorer than the equivalent person in the urban China. And finally, here is urban India, that actually, except for the very top, is poorer than rural China. And you also notice large differences between rural and urban China, almost like two different countries. And then finally, here is rural India, very poor. You see lots of people in rural India at the very bottom of the global income distribution. Some of them also catch all the way up. If they are not at global top 1%, but they're in global 10%. And they are, of course, the person in the median income in in urban India is actually only at the 20th percentile. And finally, a country that I could have actually taken as a representative of the world is Brazil, because in Brazil you have people at the very bottom of the income distribution. You have a sizable middle class. You see the median person in Brazil is at the 65th percentile globally. And then you have at the very top, they overtake the urban Chinese, and they are also part of the global top 1%. So Brazil and South Africa both would be basically like mimicking the world. They would go from the bottom to the top. So you see that, and similar graphs obviously can be done for any country, including Turkey. So you can actually then compare not only Turkey mean income to the mean income of US or Germany or China, but actually to the whole distribution between Turkey and these other countries. Okay, now for COVID, I mean, this is this is speculation. First, COVID is not over. We don't know how long it will last, how it would affect different countries. But what we can see so far is that in terms of the effect on growth, it has really been the least in China and several Asian countries. It has been really pretty bad all over Europe and the United States. It has also drawn a question, I think, which we are going to discuss for probably next 10 years. Why was the performance of the United States and Europe so abysmal? Why is it that there was a report which was strangely published in October of the last year, listing the countries. It was done by Johns Hopkins University and the Economist Intelligence Unit, listing the best countries to fight the epidemic. you cannot believe that, but the best country in the world was USA. The second country was UK. The third country is the Netherlands. Now, all these countries are disasters, and countries like Thailand, Vietnam, China, Korea, Taiwan have really been sort of considered like in the middle. So we were really wrong on that. Then next question is actually what will happen to income inequality within countries. That too is very unclear, because when the first spending started, actually, many people in Western Europe, in Europe in general, and in the US who were actually paid little normally, they actually received more through the government compensations than they were their salaries. So actually they got overcompensated. But then with the second wave of compensations, that was no longer the case, and many of them lost jobs. So, you know, I think that actually it seems that the effects within countries would be against the poor, because the richer people and more educated people are able basically to continue functioning without physically being present at their, you know, job posts, and then to continue also receiving the salaries that they were receiving before. But I think it's really way too early to say what will be the effects. I also believe that my last point is that we have not seen even the beginning of the political effects of the COVID. I think actually in the next 3 years, you know, I think the political effects of COVID would come and be very significant, in the same way that the political effects of the global financial crisis did not happen in 2008, but they really started happening after 2010 and 11.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for taking all these questions as well, and for the wonderful presentation, for joining us this evening. Thank you all for participating. This was very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure as always. Thank you for the questions. And you can use I've sent these slides, you can use them, put them on my website and do whatever you want with them. And I do hope, of course, to see you next year in Istanbul physically, and not only by you know, virtually as we did now.
That would be wonderful, and I think that will happen soon. It will be possible.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.